Is your family fragmented by favoritism? Join us for this important conversation today on Family Vision. Okay, sweetheart, question for you.
Yes.
Your favorite ice cream?
That's super easy. Peanut butter and chocolate. I think that's universally most people's favorite ice cream. At least that's what I would say.
Most people.
Most people.
If we surveyed
Yes,
100
I
people,
do. I really think
51% are saying peanut butter and
Yeah.
chocolate.
Yes.
Right. Favorite coffee? If you go to you're going to go to a coffee shop, you're going to order a coffee drink.
Right. You know, I'm so boring. I just like a cup of coffee with cream. Like, that's really what I like. That's my favorite. And every time I divert from that, I'm always back to a cup of coffee with cream, no sugar.
Saves money.
It does. I know. People think I'm spending a lot of money, but I'm just getting a cup of coffee with cream, brewed.
I'm a vanilla latte at 130 degrees. That's my specialty.
You know what?
Because I need to chug it. I don't want it hot.
Let's just make a point. That's probably the one thing where you're more high maintenance than me. That's
Temperature of drinks?
Well, yeah, that whole thing, 130, and, you know, you're very specific when you order at Starbucks, and I'm just like, cup of coffee with cream.
That's true.
It's valid.
I'll have to tell you that.
Yeah.
130-degree story another time. Okay. Very fun talking about favorite things. You'll learn a lot about people. Third question about favorites. Favorite child that we have?
Stop. I do not have a favorite child.
Good answer. It's actually probably not even like an appropriate question to
Probably
even
not.
ask
Probably
someone.
not.
But here is the reality. Every family struggles with favoritism to one degree or another. See, no one is immune from this sin of partiality. That's the way the Bible describes it in the book of James. So, honey, let's start off by talking about just some of our own experiences.
Right.
Every family deals with this. So did you experience any kind of favoritism in your family growing up?
This is, I think, is a really touchy subject. And I mean really touchy. Because my parents, I would say, bent over backwards to make sure there wasn't favoritism. Like, I grew up in a house that was, we're going to spend the exact same amount of money for every Christmas, every birthday. We're going to work really hard not to have favoritism. So if I were to say, and as I'm going to say, that there were some issues of favoritism, you know, that's sort of like a nuclear thing to say. But the reality is that my parents are both firstborns. Like, this took me a long time to figure out. But, you know, every home naturally revolves somewhat around the firstborn. And that's just because the parents are doing, you know, your firstborn, you're doing everything for the first time. So a lot of energy is put around the firstborn's life. And that's why other kids in the home can perceive that and feel that, even though maybe parents may not recognize it. And especially because both my parents are firstborns. Firstborns typically aren't aware that so much is revolving around them because everything's revolving around them. It's the only thing that they know to be true. But some of those examples are like, you know, the family friends that we were friends with, those were all my brother's friends were our family friends. That's probably one of the most practical examples, which can lead other kids in the family to feel like they're not, you know, it's a favorite because they're so used to, we're going to spend time with these friends who are, you know, my older siblings' friends. A lot of your activities that your family chooses to do often revolve around the interests of the firstborn. So that's kind of how I would say favoritism looked. But again, how maybe my sister and I would have experienced it. But again, I wouldn't say that my parents, they definitely loved us all the same and worked very hard to not have favoritism in the home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, in my family, little background here, you know, both my parents were married before they got married. And my mom brought a son from the previous marriage into her marriage with my father. So that's my brother, Mark. And my father adopted my brother, Mark, when my parents got married. So Mark was 7 years old when I was born. And in preparation for today's conversation, actually, we're doing 2 episodes on favoritism. I called my brothers a couple weeks ago and said, hey, Mark, we're going to be doing this podcast on favoritism. Can you spend some time with me and let's roll back the clock a little bit and let's just talk about some of our own experiences growing up. And we had a great conversation, and he gave me the green light to share, by the way. But one of the stories that he shared with me was the day that my parents brought me home from the hospital. And they set me in a little infant seat on the kitchen table. And my brother Mark, and 7 years older than me, a 7-year-old boy, comes up to see me, reaches out his hand to touch me. He's all excited about new baby brother. And my dad yells at him, don't touch him, your hands are dirty. And even just when I was talking to Mark, and even right now, what a heartbreaking moment. And my brother said to me, he said, in that moment, I knew I was different. And he was aware that for him, that there was something different about me being the biological child and him being the adopted child. And there was some of that dynamic throughout our growing up years. He had an up and down relationship with my dad, as I did. My brother and I had an up and down relationship. Thankfully, we're blessed with a really close brother-to-brother relationship now, which we're incredibly grateful for. But one of the things that I learned from my brother's conversation is that the reality was, when it came to my dad, in some ways I was the favored child. And when it comes to favoritism in a family, the favored child isn't aware that there's favoritism, because they're the ones who are getting the good life. They're the ones who are getting more warmth and more affection. So if you ask the favored child, is there favoritism? They say, of course not. So a lot of us honestly have a blind spot to favoritism that's actually happening in our families. Honey, talk about some of the natural ebbs and flows in family relationships, because sometimes people see favoritism where it's actually not there.
Well, and actually, I want to go back to something you said when we were planning these episodes, is that most parents don't think of themselves ever showing favoritism. If you ask parents, do you show any favoritism? 99% are probably going to say, no, I don't.
It's like a huge blind spot.
However, most kids perceive or feel favoritism at some point in their childhood, and they may not have a hard time verbalizing that, but they feel that, they experience that. And that's why there's such a disconnect on this topic. And even I think the word favoritism is somewhat a misnomer. I wish we could almost use a better word, because there is just a natural ebb and flow in a family, that even what I talked about earlier about, for example, the firstborn, you know what I mean? The firstborn child, it's not, what you said about the favorite child. It's not necessarily that they're the favorite child. It's just that so much energy and attention goes into the firstborn because the parents are learning everything for the first time. Even a great example of this was the other day. So we are now adding our third son has a significant other in his life. And then all of a sudden our daughter Lainey is thinking about dating someone, or that's a conversation. And even Ray said to me, do you remember when our W got a girlfriend and it was such a big deal? And now it's like nothing. That's the example of what I'm talking about. That's not necessarily favoritism. It's how the perception is that, everything our W did was watched by everybody else and everybody was learning. And gradually, obviously, those things change. So that's one of those things. The other thing that can cause it is there's seasons, right, where maybe one child is struggling a little bit more. There's more difficulties going on. One child is dealing with anxiety, you name it, anxiety or an issue at school, and all of a sudden the resources of the family are going to that child. Or also the classic example of just the new baby. When I had brought a new baby, and it really, it wasn't necessarily favoritism per se, but I can remember every time it was the 5-year-old that had the harder time with the new baby, because all of a sudden the 5-year-old was shifting into a way different amount of mommy time. It wasn't the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old that was impacted more. It was the 5-year-old that felt it. So from the 5-year-old perspective, that child can be internalizing, oh, my mom's playing favorites. But again, this word, it's not necessarily favoritism. It's just this dynamic of energy is changing and flowing, and parents are focusing on different things. You don't feel like you're having a favorite, but again, it's how the children are perceiving all of those dynamics that makes a difference.
And there's so much favoritism that we see in the biblical families.
Yeah, true favoritism.
In the patriarchal
right.
families. Even like the examples you were just talking about, Esau is an outdoors guy. He's a hunter, and that connected him with Isaac because Isaac likes meat and he likes wild game. Jacob's more of a homebody. And that Bible doesn't say he's a mama's boy, okay, but it said he was more connected at the home, and that connected him more to his mom, Rebekah. Going back to my family again, as my brother and I unpacked this, there were dynamics with my dad, but there were also dynamics with my mom. I had this chronic sense growing up that my mom viewed my brother as the responsible one and me as the irresponsible one. That my brother was the hard worker and I was the lazy one. My brother was the guy who fixed things and I was the one who broke things. That my brother got things done and I dropped the ball. So whether my mom did that intentionally or unintentionally is not the point, but that was just my experience. So I'm feeling less than when it comes to this comparison with my brother. Now, on the other hand, as I got into high school and then into college and then into ministry life, church was a really big part of my mom's life. So she was thrilled to have a son in ministry, thrilled to have a son who was a pastor and who was preaching. And as I talked to my brother was feeling less than. He was feeling like I was mom's favorite in that regard because she was talking about all these things I was doing. And my brother had a landscaping business. And from his perspective, that just wasn't as big a deal in my mom's eyes as me being a pastor and me being in ministry. So these examples of favoritism or partiality, again, whether they're intentional or unintentional is not the point. It's the effect that these things can have on our kids and our need to really be aware. Like Amy said just a minute ago, I think it was a great point, honey, when you said if you surveyed parents, how many of you play favorites with your kids? You said 99% would say no. I think almost 100 would say no. Maybe some people might acknowledge it, but it's a great, great point that as parents, we are unlikely to see this. So we're going to be coming back.
And let me just address, because it's not, the reason why we have that feeling is because we do love most parents aren't playing favorites and they do love all of their kids, the same. They love them differently, but they love them with the same amount of love. And that's why parents have that response, which is normal,
Right. So we're going to be coming back to do part 2 on this, but there's a lot more to talk about. I want to do a couple action items, though, in this episode, a couple practical ways that parents can push back on favoritism in our families.
Well, I have a really practical one that came to me, and as we wrote this one, it was fun to kind of reflect on this. And one thing when I realized a lot of dynamics with your firstborn, I had, RW was first and Lissy was second, and she definitely had this experience where she felt that RW was a favorite for sure. She felt that because he was a very compliant child. That was one thing. She was much more strong-willed, so it just added to a dynamic. But one thing that was really critical that helped a lot was I realized that, the activity that she was in was dance. And so dance meant that there were lessons every week that we would go and often we would stay there, but we would, or sometimes we'd drop her off. But she had one recital a year. Do you remember? It was this one weekend. It was dress rehearsal and 2 performances. In contrast, during that time, we would go watch RW play lots of soccer games, lots of basketball games, lots of baseball games. And not only were we watching, but Grandma and Bop are watching. And, it was an event. Right. So there was an event happening all the time around RW's activities, whereas Lissy didn't have that for all those 9 months. And when I began to understand that was part of her perception, that, she... that was so helpful that we were just able to talk about it and process it. And she really, it all began to make sense why she was feeling that way, because there were very few things that she was doing that age that all the family was that involved in. And that really helped me to understand that recital, like my life stopped for that recital weekend, because I would make such a big deal. The funny thing is I'd bring the boys to their dress rehearsal and both performances, and I would tell them, listen, your sister's watched about 50 things. You're coming to everything. You know what I mean? Like, right. You're coming and we're celebrating. And so that was such a big deal. But that was an example of, okay, was I playing favorites? No. But how was she perceiving the dynamics of our family? She was feeling less than because of those just really basic practical dynamics. But the neat thing is that, as you address them and talk about them, your kids can understand these things, so it really did help diffuse the problem as we went forward. And, just a good practical example. You could find things in your own family where you could maybe see that interesting kind of discrepancy in just where the time and energy is going in your family.
Yep. Well, those are great. And again, we're going to continue this conversation in our next episode. But before you go, I've got to tell you about this fantastic online parenting conference coming your way beginning April 14th. It's from our partners at Christian Parenting. It's the Perfectly Imperfect digital event. I love that. Perfectly Imperfect Parents. It's called Every Parent Wants to Know. 40 speakers on all sorts of critical topics, on technology, on faith development in the home, family devotions, single parenting, grandparenting, talking to your kids about sexuality. It's really going to be a great event to encourage and equip you in your mission as a mom or a dad. The event launches on April 14th. Again, it's all online. You get 2 months to watch and learn. Have some friends over. You can use it in a small group at church, and you can get all the info and register at our website, visionaryfam.com/everyparent. visionaryfam.com/everyparent. We know that you will love it. And as always, we'd love to hear from you, to hear about how Family Vision is making a difference in your life, to hear prayer requests from your family. You can email us at podcast@visionaryfam.com. And we can't wait for our next time with you on Family Vision.